Maria Santos had always been the kind of person who helped others without asking for anything in return. At 28 years old, she worked as a social worker in the rough neighborhoods of Detroit, spending her days trying to keep kids off the streets and helping families get back on their feet. Her colleagues knew her as someone who never gave up on people, even when everyone else had written them off. On a cold Tuesday morning in November 2019, Maria left her small apartment on the east side of the city to meet with a client family. She had been working with the Johnson family for 6 months, trying to help them navigate the legal system after their teenage son had been arrested for drug possession. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. at a community center in one of the most dangerous parts of the city. Maria's supervisor, Janet Williams, started getting worried when Maria didn't show up for their 2 p.m. meeting. This wasn't like Maria at all. She was always punctual, always professional, and always kept in touch. Janet tried calling Maria's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She called the community center, but they said Maria had never shown up for her morning appointment. By evening, Janet had contacted Maria's family and closest friends. Nobody had heard from her. Maria's sister Carmen was the first to call the police. She told the officers that Maria would never just disappear without telling someone. She was responsible, caring, and had never done anything reckless in her life. The Detroit Police Department opened a missing person case, but Detective Robert Hayes, who was assigned to the investigation, had seen cases like this before. Young women in dangerous neighborhoods sometimes got caught up in the wrong crowd or became victims of crime. The area where Maria was last seen was known for drug activity and gang violence. Detective Hayes interviewed Maria's co-workers and family members, but nobody could give him any useful information about what might have happened to her. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The police searched the area where Maria was last seen, checked hospitals and morgues, and followed up on several tips from the community. But every lead went nowhere. Maria's car was found 3 days after she disappeared, parked outside an abandoned building about 2 miles from where she was supposed to meet the Johnson family. The car was unlocked, and her purse was still inside with her wallet and identification. Maria's family refused to give up hope. Her sister Carmen organized search parties every weekend, posting flyers around the neighborhood and pleading with anyone who might have information to come forward. The local news covered the story several times, but as the months passed, media attention faded and the case grew cold. The social services office where Maria worked held a memorial service 6 months after her disappearance. Her colleagues shared stories about her dedication to helping others and her unwavering optimism, even in the face of the most difficult cases. Many people spoke about how Maria had changed their lives, from the families she had helped to the co-workers she had inspired. Carmen Santos never stopped believing her sister was alive somewhere. She kept Maria's apartment exactly as it had been, paying the rent month after month, and hoping that one day Maria would walk through the door with an explanation for everything. She continued to contact Detective Hayes regularly, asking about any new developments in the case. The detective had moved on to other cases, but he still thought about Maria Santos from time to time. He had reviewed the case, filed dozens of times, looking for something he might have missed. The truth was, people disappeared in Detroit more often than anyone wanted to admit. Sometimes they were victims of violence. Sometimes they chose to start new lives somewhere else. And sometimes they got caught up in situations they couldn't escape from. As the first anniversary of Maria's disappearance approached, Detective Hayes was getting ready to officially classify the case as a cold case. He had exhausted all the usual investigative techniques and had no new leads to pursue. Maria's family would be notified, and while the case would remain open, active investigation would stop unless new evidence emerged. What nobody knew was that Maria Santos was very much alive, but she was living through an experience that would test every skill she had learned as a social worker and every ounce of strength she possessed as a human being. The place where she had ended up was unlike anything she could have imagined, and the people she was with were facing challenges that made her old job seem simple by comparison. Maria had not chosen to disappear, and she had not been the victim of a random crime. Instead, She had stumbled into a situation that would change not only her own life, but the lives of dozens of other people who had been forgotten by the world outside. Her training as a social worker, her natural leadership abilities, and her refusal to give up on people would soon be put to the ultimate test in ways she never could have anticipated. The community center where Maria was supposed to meet the Johnson family that November morning was located in a part of the city that most people avoided. But Maria had never been afraid of dangerous neighborhoods. She believed that the people who lived in these areas needed help the most, and she was determined to provide that help regardless of the risks involved. What she didn't know was that her commitment to helping others would soon put her in a position where she would become the person that others looked to for help in the most desperate circumstances imaginable. The skills she had developed working with troubled families and at-risk youth would become the foundation for something much bigger than she had ever dreamed possible. As Detective Hayes prepared to close the active investigation into Maria's disappearance, he had no way of knowing that the woman he was looking for was about to embark on a journey that would transform her from a missing person into a leader who would give hope to people who had given up on ever seeing freedom again. The story of Maria Santos was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The last thing Maria remembered from that Tuesday morning was parking her car outside the community center and seeing a group of men loading boxes into a van. She had walked toward the building entrance when someone called her name. When she turned around, everything went black. Maria woke up in complete darkness, her head pounding and her mouth dry as cotton. She was lying on a concrete floor in what felt like a small room. As her eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light filtering through a crack under what must have been a door, she realized she was not alone. She could hear other people breathing in the darkness around her. "Hello," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't talk too loud," came a quiet response from somewhere to her left. "The guards don't like noise." Guards? Maria's mind raced as she tried to understand what was happening. She carefully moved her hands around, feeling the cold concrete beneath her and the rough walls nearby. The room smelled of fear, sweat, and something else she couldn't identify. "Where are we?" she asked the voice in the darkness. Underground, the voice replied. It belonged to a woman, and she sounded young. "Nobody knows we're here. Nobody's coming to help us." As hours passed, Maria learned the horrifying truth about where she had ended up. She was in an abandoned subway tunnel beneath Detroit, part of a network of underground passages that had been forgotten by the city above. But these tunnels weren't empty. They had been turned into a prison by a criminal organization that trafficked people for forced labor. There were 37 other people trapped in the underground facility with Maria. They ranged in age from teenagers to elderly adults, and they came from all walks of life. Some had been homeless when they were taken. Others had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, just like Maria. What they all had in common was that nobody above ground was looking for them hard enough to find them. The woman who had first spoken to Maria in the darkness was named Lisa Chun. She was 22 years old and had been a college student studying engineering before she was kidnapped 6 months earlier. Lisa had been walking home from the library one evening when she was grabbed off the street. Her family had reported her missing, but like Maria, she had simply vanished without a trace. During the day, the prisoners were forced to work in different areas of the underground complex. Some worked in a makeshift factory assembling counterfeit electronics. Others were forced to package drugs that would be sold on the streets above. The work was dangerous, the conditions were terrible, and anyone who refused to work or tried to cause trouble was punished severely. The criminal organization that ran the operation was led by a man called Victor, though none of the prisoners had ever seen him in person. The day-to-day operations were managed by guards who lived in a separate section of the tunnels. These guards were armed and had made it clear that any attempt to escape would result in serious consequences, not just for the person trying to escape, but for everyone in the facility. Maria's background as a social worker had taught her how to read people and understand their needs, even in difficult circumstances. As she spent more time in the underground prison, she began to notice things that others might have missed. She saw how the different prisoners dealt with their situation, who was struggling the most, and who might be ready to give up hope entirely. There was David Martinez, a 45-year-old construction worker who had been taken 8 months earlier. David had a wife and 3 children above ground, and he spent most of his time staring at a photo he had managed to hide from the guards. He was strong physically, but Maria could see that he was breaking down emotionally. Then there was Sarah Thompson, a 17-year-old who had aged out of the foster care system and been living on the streets when she was captured. Sarah had learned not to trust adults, and she kept to herself most of the time. But Maria noticed that Sarah was smart and observant, always paying attention to what the guards were doing and when they changed shifts. As weeks passed, Maria began to understand the routine of the underground facility. She learned which guards were more brutal than others, what times of day there was less supervision, and how the prisoners were moved between different work areas. More importantly, she began to earn the trust of the other prisoners. Maria's training had taught her that people in crisis needed 3 things: hope, purpose, and a sense that someone cared about what happened to them. Even in this terrible situation, she began to provide those things to the people around her. She listened to their stories, shared what little food she could spare, and reminded them that they were more than just prisoners. The turning point came when a new prisoner arrived. His name was Marcus Johnson, and he was the 16-year-old son of the family Maria had been trying to help before she disappeared. Marcus had been arrested again, but instead of going to juvenile detention, he had somehow ended up in the underground facility. When Maria saw him, she realized that the criminal organization had connections that reached deep into the city's legal system. Marcus was terrified and confused. He didn't understand how he had ended up in this place instead of in a normal jail. Maria knew she had to protect him, but she also realized that Marcus might be the key to something bigger. If the people running this operation had connections in law enforcement and the courts, it meant they were more powerful and more dangerous than she had originally thought. It also meant that the prisoners couldn't rely on the authorities above ground to rescue them. If they're going to get out of this place, they would have to save themselves. Maria began to have quiet conversations with some of the other prisoners, especially Lisa and David. She didn't talk about escape directly, but she began to plant seeds of an idea. She reminded them that they were not powerless, that they had skills and knowledge that could be useful, and that they had something the guards didn't have: the motivation of people who had nothing left to lose. The guards had made a mistake when they brought Maria to the underground facility. They saw her as just another social worker who had gotten too close to the wrong situation. What they didn't realize was that they had brought in someone who knew how to organize people, how to build trust in desperate circumstances, and how to turn a group of scared individuals into a team that could work together toward a common goal. Maria Santos had disappeared from the world above, but she was about to emerge as something the criminal organization had never encountered before: a leader who could unite the forgotten people in their underground prison and turn them into a force that would threaten everything the criminals had built. 3 months after Maria's arrival in the underground facility, she had become someone the other prisoners turned to when they needed help or hope. She had a way of making people feel like they mattered, even in a place designed to strip away their humanity. But Maria knew that giving people hope wasn't enough if there was no real possibility of change. The breakthrough came when Maria befriended an older prisoner named Robert Kim, a former Army engineer who had been homeless when he was taken. Robert had been in the facility for over a year, and he had spent that time carefully studying the layout of the tunnel system. He had noticed things that even the guards didn't fully understand about the old subway infrastructure. These tunnels weren't just for trains, Robert explained to Maria during one of their whispered conversations while they worked in the electronics assembly area. They're connected to steam tunnels, water mains, and electrical conduits that run all over the city. Some of these passages haven't been used in decades, but they're still there. Robert had been an expert in military engineering before his life fell apart due to PTSD and addiction. He understood structural systems, electrical networks, and how to read the kind of blueprints that might show hidden passages or forgotten connections. More importantly, he had been quietly mapping the facility in his head for months. Maria realized that Robert's knowledge could be the foundation for something much bigger than individual escape attempts. If they could understand the full layout of the underground system, they might be able to find ways to move around without being detected by the guards. They might even be able to find ways to communicate with the outside world. But Maria also understood that any plan would require more than just two people. She needed to build a network of trust among the prisoners, and she needed to identify people who had skills that could be useful in a larger operation. Her training as a social worker had taught her how to assess people's strengths and how to bring out the best in them, even under difficult circumstances. She began to pay closer attention to the other prisoners during their work shifts and their brief rest periods. There was Jennifer Walsh, a former nurse who had become addicted to prescription drugs and lost her job and her home. Jennifer still had medical knowledge that could be crucial if anyone was injured during an escape attempt. Then there was Tony Russo, a young man who had grown up in foster care and had learned to be street smart in ways that most people couldn't imagine. Tony knew how to pick locks, how to move quietly, and how to read people's intentions quickly. He was suspicious of authority figures, but Maria could see that underneath his tough exterior, he desperately wanted to believe that things could get better. Maria also identified prisoners who might not have technical skills, but who had other qualities that would be important. Sarah Thompson, the teenager who had been living on the streets, was incredibly observant and had an amazing memory for details. David Martinez, the construction worker, was physically strong and had experience working as part of a team under pressure. The challenge was bringing these people together without attracting the attention of the guards. The facility was designed to prevent prisoners from organizing. They were moved between different work areas on rotating schedules. They were not allowed to gather in groups during rest periods, and the guard were always watching for signs of cooperation or planning. Maria used her social work skills to begin building individual relationships with each of the people she had identified. She found ways to help them with small problems, to listen to their concerns, and to demonstrate that she could be trusted. She never talked directly about escape or resistance during these early conversations. Instead, she focused on helping people maintain their sense of dignity and purpose. The real organizing began when Maria suggested that some of the prisoners start sharing their knowledge and skills with others during work periods. She framed it as a way to help people cope with their situation and stay mentally active. Jennifer began teaching basic first aid to other prisoners. Robert started explaining how mechanical systems worked to people who were interested. Tony shared techniques for staying alert and aware of what was happening around them. What looked like informal education and mutual support was actually the foundation of something much more organized. As people began to trust each other and work together, Maria started to have more direct conversations about their situation. She never used the word escape in these discussions. Instead, she talked about the possibility of changing their circumstances or finding new opportunities. The guards noticed that the prisoners seemed to have better morale than before, but they didn't see this as a problem. Happy prisoners were easier to manage than desperate ones, and the work was still getting done efficiently. What the guard didn't realize was that the improved morale was the result of careful planning and organization, not just acceptance of their situation. Maria's network grew slowly and carefully. By the end of her 4th month in the facility, she had a core group of 12 people who understood that they were working together towards something bigger than individual survival. Each of these people had specific roles and responsibilities, though they never discussed their activities in ways that would seem suspicious to the guards. Robert continued to map the tunnel system and identify potential routes that might lead to the surface. Jennifer made sure that everyone in the group stayed as healthy as possible and began stockpiling basic medical supplies. Tony observed the guards' routines and identified weaknesses in their security procedures. Sarah kept track of details about timing, schedules, and patterns that might be important later. But Maria knew that even the best planning would be meaningless without the right opportunity. They needed something that would distract the guards or create confusion that would allow them to move without being detected. They also needed to be prepared for the possibility that their escape attempt might fail and result in severe punishment for everyone involved. The opportunity came when Maria learned about a scheduled delivery that would bring new prisoners to the facility. Robert had overheard two guards talking about modifications they were making to one section of the tunnels to accommodate more people. This meant that there would be more activity than usual, more people moving around, and potentially more chances for confusion that could be used to their advantage. Maria realized that this might be their only chance for a long time. She began to prepare her network for what she was starting to think of as the day everything changes. She couldn't tell them exactly what was going to happen because she wasn't entirely sure herself, but she could make sure they were ready to act quickly if an opportunity presented itself. What Maria didn't know was that her activities had not gone completely unnoticed. One of the guards had begun to suspect that something was different about the way the prisoners were behaving. He hadn't figured out what they were planning, but he was starting to pay closer attention to Maria specifically. The next few weeks would determine whether Maria's careful organizing would lead to freedom for the people who had trusted her, or whether her efforts to build hope in a hopeless place would result in consequences that would be worse than anything they had experienced so far. The morning of the planned delivery arrived with an unusual amount of activity in the underground facility. Maria could hear guards moving around more than normal, and there was a tension in the air that suggested something big was happening. She knew this might be their only chance, but she also knew that if they failed, the consequences would be severe for everyone involved. Maria had spent the previous week making sure that every member of her network understood their role without discussing specific details that could be overheard by guards. Robert had identified 3 possible routes that might lead to the surface, though he couldn't be certain any of them would actually work. Jennifer had gathered basic medical supplies and hidden them in different locations throughout their work areas. Tony had observed that the guards would be distracted during the delivery process, and Sarah had memorized the timing of all their usual routines. The delivery was scheduled to arrive at 2 p.m., which meant that most of the current prisoners would be in their work areas when the new people were brought in. Maria's plan was simple in concept, but would require perfect timing and a lot of luck. While the guards were busy processing the new arrivals, her network would create small disturbances in different parts of the facility that would draw attention away from the route Robert had identified as their best chance of reaching the surface. But before Maria could put her plan into action, everything changed in a way she had never anticipated. At 11 a.m., 3 hours before the scheduled delivery, Maria was working in the electronics assembly area when she heard shouting from the direction of the guards' quarters. At first, she thought it might be part of the normal chaos that occurred before deliveries. But the shouting continued, and it sounded different from anything she had heard before. Tony, who was working near the entrance to their area, came over to Maria with a concerned expression on his face. "Something's wrong," he whispered. "I heard gunshots from somewhere up near the main entrance." Maria's mind raced. Gunshots could mean a lot of different things. Maybe the delivery had arrived early and there had been some kind of problem. Maybe law enforcement had finally found the facility. Or maybe there was conflict between different criminal groups who were involved in the operation. What Maria didn't know was that Detective Robert Hayes, who had officially closed the investigation into her disappearance, had never actually given up looking for her. 6 months after Maria vanished, Hayes had gotten a tip from an informant who claimed to know something about people being held underground in the old subway tunnels. Hayes had spent weeks following up on this lead, and he had finally convinced his supervisors to authorize a raid on what they believed might be a major human trafficking operation. The raid was supposed to be carefully coordinated, but something had gone wrong. The criminal organization had been tipped off that law enforcement was getting close, and they had decided to abandon the facility and eliminate any evidence of their operation. This included getting rid of the prisoners who could testify against them. When the shooting started, Maria realized that waiting for the perfect moment was no longer an option. Whatever was happening above ground, it was clear that the situation in the underground facility was becoming more dangerous by the minute. She made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a few months earlier. She was going to lead everyone out, whether they were part of her network or not. Maria moved quickly through the work areas, speaking to every prisoner she could reach. She didn't have time to explain everything, and she couldn't guarantee that her plan would work. But she could offer something that nobody else in the facility could provide: leadership in a crisis and a real chance at freedom. "We're leaving," she told each person as she found them. "Right now. Follow Robert and do exactly what he says. If we get separated, try to stay together in small groups and keep moving toward any light you can see." Most of the prisoners were too scared to move at first. They had been in the facility for months or even years, and the idea of trying to escape had seemed impossible for so long that many of them had given up even thinking about it. But Maria's confidence and the urgency of the situation convinced them that this might be their only chance. Robert led the way through the passage he had identified, moving carefully but quickly through sections of the tunnel system that the guards rarely patrolled. The route was narrow and dark, and several times they had to crawl through spaces that were barely wide enough for a person to fit through. But Robert's engineering background had been correct. These forgotten passages did connect to other parts of the underground infrastructure. Behind them, Maria could hear more gunshots and shouting. She didn't know if the guards were fighting with law enforcement or with each other, but she knew that staying in the facility was no longer safe for any of the prisoners. She helped people who were struggling with the physical demands of moving through the narrow passages, and she made sure that no one was left behind. Jennifer proved invaluable during the escape. When one of the elderly prisoners had trouble breathing in the dusty, confined spaces, she knew how to help him stay calm and keep moving. When a young woman panicked and wanted to go back, Jennifer was able to talk her through her fear and convince her to keep following the group. Tony used his street smarts to help the group move quietly and avoid areas where they might encounter guards. He also served as a scout, moving ahead of the main group to check for dangers and then coming back to guide them around potential problems. Sarah's memory for details became crucial when they reached a section of the tunnels where Robert wasn't certain which direction to go. She had observed enough about the layout of the facility to help him make decisions about which passages were most likely to lead toward the surface. The escape took over 4 hours. They had to stop several times when they heard voices or footsteps nearby, hiding in side passages or maintenance areas until it was safe to continue moving. They had to help several people who were injured or exhausted, and they had to find ways around sections of tunnel that had collapsed or been blocked off. But Maria's leadership held the group together. When people wanted to give up, she reminded them that they had already come farther than anyone had ever thought possible. When they were scared about what they would find on the surface, she assured them that whatever was waiting for them above ground had to be better than what they were leaving behind. Finally, after what felt like an endless journey through the darkness, they saw something that most of them had not seen in months: natural light filtering down from above. Robert had found a passage that led to a storm drain that connected to the surface. One by one, 38 people climbed out of the underground facility that had been their prison and emerged into the afternoon sunlight on a Detroit street. Maria was the last person to climb out of the storm drain. As she stood on the surface for the first time in 6 months, she looked around at the group of people she had led to freedom. They were dirty, exhausted, and scared about what would happen next. But they were alive, and they were free, and they were together. What they didn't know was that Maria Santos, the missing social worker who had vanished without a trace 6 months earlier, was about to walk back into a world that had assumed she was dead. And she wasn't coming back alone. The first person to see Maria emerge from the storm drain was a Detroit police officer named Patricia Rodriguez, who was part of the team that had been searching the area after the raid on the underground facility. Officer Rodriguez had been walking the perimeter when she saw movement near a storm drain that was supposed to be sealed. When she investigated, she found herself face to face with a group of people who looked like they had been through hell. "Ma'am, I need you to step back and identify yourself," Officer Rodriguez said, reaching for her radio while keeping her eyes on the group. She could tell these people were not dangerous, but she had no idea where they had come from or how they had gotten there. Maria stepped forward, raising her hands to show she wasn't a threat. "My name is Maria Santos," she said clearly. "I'm a social worker with Detroit Family Services, and I was reported missing 6 months ago. These people were being held prisoner in the tunnels underground. We need medical attention and protection." Officer Rodriguez felt her heart skip a beat. She had heard about the Maria Santos case during roll call briefings. Everyone in the department knew about the social worker who had vanished without a trace. And now here she was leading a group of what appeared to be other missing persons up out of a storm drain. Within minutes, the street was filled with police cars, ambulances, and news trucks. Detective Robert Hayes arrived at the scene 20 minutes after the first call came in. When he saw Maria standing there, alive and clearly in charge of the situation, he had to sit down on the curb for a moment to catch his breath. "Maria Santos," he said when he finally walked over to her. "We've been looking for you for 6 months. Your family never gave up hope, but honestly, most of us thought you were dead." Maria looked at Detective Hayes with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "I know you did the best you could with the information you had," she said. "But there are things happening in this city that are much bigger than one missing person case. These people with me have been missing for months or years, and nobody was looking for them because nobody knew where to look." As paramedics checked on the former prisoners and social workers began the process of identifying people and contacting their families, Maria found herself in the unusual position of being both a victim and a witness to one of the largest human trafficking operations Detroit had ever uncovered. The underground facility that Maria and the others had escaped from was part of a network that extended throughout the city and connected to operations in other states. The criminal organization that had been running it had connections to corrupt officials in law enforcement, the court system, and city government. The raid that had provided cover for their escape had been partially successful, but many of the top leaders of the organization had escaped before they could be arrested. Maria spent the next 3 days being interviewed by FBI agents, state investigators, and local detectives. She provided detailed information about the layout of the underground facility, the routines of the guards, and the identities of other prisoners who might still be trapped in other locations. But she also did something that surprised everyone involved in the investigation. She insisted on being present during the interviews with the people she had led to freedom. "These people have been through trauma that most people can't imagine," Maria explained to the investigators. "They need someone they trust to be with them while they tell their stories. They need to know that someone is going to advocate for them and make sure they get the help they need." Agent Sarah Mitchell, who was leading the federal investigation, had initially been reluctant to allow a victim to be present during witness interviews. But she quickly realized that Maria had a unique relationship with the other survivors and that her presence made them more willing to share information that was crucial to the investigation. "What you did down there was remarkable," Agent Mitchell told Maria after one particularly difficult interview. "You took a group of people who had given up hope and turned them into a team that could work together to escape from an impossible situation. That takes a special kind of leadership." Maria's family was overwhelmed with joy at her return, but they could see that the experience had changed her. Her sister Carmen noticed that Maria was different in ways that were hard to describe. She was still the same caring, determined person she had always been, but she had a new kind of confidence and a deeper understanding of what people were capable of when they were pushed to their limits. "I keep thinking about the people who are still down there," Maria told Carmen one evening as they sat in the kitchen of the apartment that Carmen had kept exactly as Maria had left it. "We got 38 people out, but there are more facilities like that one. There are more people who need help, and most of them don't have anyone looking for them." The investigation into the underground trafficking operation continued for months, leading to dozens of arrests and the discovery of several other facilities in Detroit and other cities. Many of the people who had been rescued with Maria's help became key witnesses in the prosecution of the criminals who had held them captive. The case made national headlines and led to changes in how law enforcement agencies investigate missing person cases, particularly when the victims are homeless or otherwise marginalized. But for Maria, the most important outcome was personal. The experience of leading people to freedom in the most desperate circumstances imaginable had shown her that she was capable of things she had never thought possible. It had also shown her that there were problems in the world that required more than traditional social work approaches to solve. 6 months after her return to the surface, Maria made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She resigned from her job at Detroit Family Services and enrolled in a graduate program to study criminal justice and victim advocacy. Her goal was to develop new approaches to identifying and helping victims of human trafficking, particularly those who were unlikely to be found through conventional investigations. I learned something important while I was underground, Maria explained to her former supervisor, Janet Williams, when she submitted her resignation letter. Sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones who have been written off by everyone else. And sometimes the only way to help them is to be willing to go places that other people won't go and do things that other people won't do. Maria also began working with the FBI and other law enforcement agencies as a consultant, helping them understand how trafficking operations worked from the perspective of the victims. She developed training programs for detectives and social workers that focused on identifying the signs that someone might be trapped in forced labor situations. But perhaps most importantly, Maria maintained contact with the people she had led to freedom. She helped them navigate the legal system, find housing and employment, and access the mental health services they needed to heal from their experiences. She became the person they could call when they needed someone to advocate for them or when they just needed to talk to someone who understood what they had been through. Robert Kim, the former Army engineer who had mapped the tunnels, eventually found stable housing and got treatment for his PTSD. He began working with Maria to develop safety protocols for people who were at risk of being trafficked. Jennifer Walsh, the former nurse, completed a rehabilitation program and returned to nursing, specializing in trauma care. Tony Russo used his street knowledge to help other at-risk youth avoid dangerous situations. 5 years after her disappearance, Maria Santos had become one of the most respected victim advocates in the Midwest. She had helped law enforcement agencies across the country improve their approach to trafficking investigations, and she had been instrumental in the rescue of hundreds of people from situations similar to what she had experienced. But when people asked her about her work, Maria always focused on the same message. The most important thing was never to give up on people, no matter how hopeless their situation might seem. Everyone told me that the people I was with underground were lost, Maria would say when she spoke at conferences and training programs. They had been written off by society, forgotten by their families, and given up on by law enforcement. But they weren't lost. They were just waiting for someone to show them that they still had value and that freedom was still possible. The story of Maria Santos became a reminder that sometimes the people who seem to have disappeared aren't actually gone. Sometimes they're just waiting for someone to help them find their way back to the light.